So as Andy said, I now work with the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium, and I'm volunteering my time. It's really an activity around a common theme that I've seen in the West for the last 15 or 20 years, and that is that because of the lack of fresh water, the lack and the changes in climate, we're looking at non-traditional water resources as a way to support sustainable economic development, and that includes energy development uh, as well as industrial development. So what I'm going to really focus on in this presentation is some of the issues around freshwater availability, climate impacts on freshwater ability, and why we're have some national programs now in non-traditional water reuse, headed by the US EPA, and then some directions on what that's going to mean, I think, for the Western states, and opportunities to use these non-traditional waters to support energy development and other economic development. So this is tree ring data from the University of Arizona. A lot of people have plotted it up logarithmically. What I did is I plotted this up about, like I say, 15 years ago in 50-year segments or averages. So it's a running 50-year average, if you will. And the reason I did that is I had been reading a number of things about former arid cycles, and they called them long-term droughts. And I like to use the term arid cycles because what I see in the data is these cycles of aridity and wet. And generally, what I'm seeing is that you look at this, that the dry cycles are on the order of 300 years, and the wet cycles are on the order of a couple of hundred years. And so when I went back and looked at this is data that's representative of the mid latitudes, which New Mexico and Southwest and even southeastern U.S. are in, but it's also the same areas, the mid latitudes that you see in northern Africa, southern Europe, the Mid East, India, China, in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, places like South Africa and Argentina, Australia, and Southeast Asia. And then when you look at then at going through some of these collapses of civilizations that occurred, and civilizations that essentially were abandoned because, and you look at it, they all line up with these mid-latitude arid cycles that occur. Yeah. And so it's very interesting in my book that if you look at historically, in the 400s, you had the kind of the collapse of Rome, which was around water issues. You had the Mayan abandonment. You had the Anasazi abandonment. You had the Angkor Wat abandonment, Southeast Asia. All were during these arid cycles because these civilizations did not have a way to adapt. They were based upon fresh surface water. As that decreased by significant amounts, you saw these abandonments. And if you look at where we are today, just looking at the tree ring data, historical, that we're in one of the most historic arid cycles that we've had in the last 2,000 years, probably in the last 4,000 years, when the Sahara ended up becoming a desert. So this is a big deal. And if you look at the differences in the average rainfall, we're seeing plus or minus 40% changes in average rainfall. Right now, we're at that minus 40%. So you're looking at a factor of 2 in overall water supply availability if you look at back in the 1850s or 1880s. So people talk about climate change. How much of that is carbon driven? I don't know. Some of it looks like it is. But we've had these changes that occur. We have not been addressing how to interact with these. So my point that I'm trying to make to people when I give this presentation is we haven't bottomed out. Generally, there's if you see all of these trends, there's a wet spell that comes in between these arid cycles. I think we had a wet spell, a more rainfall impacted spell from about 1970 to 2000. And now we're back into the same kinds of arid issues that we had prior to that in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So I think we're in this for the long run, another at least 50 to 70 years before we start maybe coming out of this trend. And that's my point is just saying, well, we'll try to conserve. It's a big deal on how to be more efficient when you've got another 100 years of this arid cycle. And that we've got to look at other alternatives and other water supplies. And then I just have some data here that when will we ever learn? So the fact is that when we have these arid cycles, what do? We still continue to operate as normal. We cannot seem to ration ourselves. And if you look at the on the left, the freshwater supply availability based upon water that can be withdrawn from dams, we have maxed out on our fresh surface water supply capability in the United States. And what we've done is we've substituted fresh surface water for the last 30 or 40 years with groundwater. And of course, we haven't set up a lot of sustainable groundwater development. And in the middle of the country, the Ogallala is a big poster child for unsustainable water supply development. But if you look at all the other major groundwater aquifers in the United States, they're also over pumped or impacted, mismanaged. So the point is, we have not learned to, even from all these abandonments that we've seen and the issues that have occurred, we haven't learned to manage our water supplies appropriately. And I think that is a big issue that we're going to see in the West for the next 50 to 70 years. It's going to impact us. And I'd like to show this figure. This is from the GAO. I actually worked with Andy and others on our Energy Water Committee to work with the GAO to get this data back in 2014 or 2010. And this was a evaluation by water managers of what their water stress was going to be in the next decade or through 2023. And you see the states that have identified that they're going to have water stress. Essentially, I think 45 out of the 50 states or so identified water stress as a major concern. Freshwater supply availability under either normal or regional conditions, or local or regional. So you can see the Rocky Mountain West, almost all the states except for Utah say they have a water stress problem, and expected that. So I think this is not just a Southwest problem or a Western problem. It's a problem across the country that needs to be addressed. We need to have better water. So the point here with this, the 98th meridian, everybody talks about the 98th meridian. There are different water laws and even water legislation in the U.S. code for if you're west of the 98th meridian, you manage your water. You can use things like produced water for agriculture, and west of the 98th meridian, you can't do that on the east of the 98th meridian. And the reason that the 98th meridian is talked about, because there's a major, we're essentially two different countries, an arid country in the west and a humid country in the eastern U.S. And if you really look at the water withdrawals, 80% of water use is for irrigation in the west, and 80% of water use in the east is for energy. And a lot of people don't know that there's so much energy development based upon the amount of water availability in the eastern U.S. And so when we kind of look at water issues associated with energy development, in the West, you're competing, energy development's competing with irrigation and food. And in the East, it's competing against other uses for industry, and it has big impacts on water temperatures in the East. So everybody looks at water differently, but in essence, water is a big driver for energy development. So when you're looking at a new energy system, whether that's more renewables or a hydrogen economy, I've always thought that you needed to look at the energy water demand on energy so that you can develop a sustainable energy system as well as a sustainable water system. And this is a graph that I put together actually in 2000, kind of pointing out the differences between what people conceive as what drives economic development versus the reality of what drives economic development. And if you look at GDP, which is the black line there, as a function of electricity use and energy availability versus water availability, what economic development matches really and tracks with is water availability. And the reason for that is, you need water for agriculture and food, you need water for manufacturing, you need water for energy and domestic water supplies, and then water for recreation. So if you don't have the water resources, you can't do the manufacturing, you can't do the agriculture, you can't do the energy development. And then I have a quote there from Fortune magazine in 2015 that says, from an economic standpoint, water is going to be more important than oil. And I'm getting ready to show a couple slides that I think that water issues are more important than climate change and greenhouse gases. And there's a study that was done by CDP talking about water hydrology and economic concerns by 2030. And they're the big point. I think here is kind of the bottom two boxes. The one on the left, water will have more rapid and unavoidable consequences for some businesses than carbon. And the other one is that the global economy will favor businesses that take a proactive approach to water stewardship. And that's the big issue here, is that I think some of the economic groups are beginning to see that the water availability is driving economic development, just like the graph that I previously showed. And the point is, as we look at new energy technologies, we've got to make sure that we do things that are smart from a water perspective. And there are things that we can do. Solar energy does not require a significant amount of water if you're using photovoltaics. Wind does not require a significant amount of water. Therefore, those innovations in energy supply are positive. What about a hydrogen economy? What about a biofuels economy? What do those have as impacts on water supply? So I think we need to start looking at those other issues. Here's some of the work that Andy and I did on Energy Water Nexus, looking at electric power. If we transition from coal plants, which is fossil and biomass steam turbines, their average is maybe 400 gallons of water per megawatt hour. But if you look at some of the emerging trends, natural gas combined cycle is half that water consumption and half the CO2 generation. So a natural gas combined cycle from an overall water and environmental standpoint is a very good transition from coal to natural gas. If you try to then sequester the CO2 from a natural gas turbine, it increases water consumption by 80%. So maybe by just doing natural gas combined cycle with things like wind and solar, which have really low water use and really low carbon, you might get a much better sustainability from the energy system, because you have low water use and low greenhouse gas emission uses. Where if you went to sequestration of CO2 from a natural gas combined cycle, you're actually adding costs to the energy system, and you're using a lot more water. So those are some trade-offs that we have to look at when we do energy discussions. And I think I'm going to make a case here in a minute that some people have looked at this and decided that, just going with natural gas and wind and solar gives you a lot of energy security, gives you a lot of energy reliability, and yet it has very, very low impacts on both CO2 and water. So I think we need to look at our natural resources together and not try to optimize for just one natural resource, which is CO2, and look at the other things like land, like water. Another water consumption issue on fuels, as we look at a hydrogen economy and moving toward transportation fuels that are based upon hydrogen and hydrogen use to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What you have here is you kind of need to look at, okay, what's the water consumption associated with the hydrogen economy? And down at the very bottom, looking ahead, like 15 years ago, we had hydrogen on there. So there's hydrogen with natural gas reforming and hydrogen with electrolysis. And both of those use a significantly larger amount of water than just conventional oil and gas refining of transportation fuels. So, 1 gallon of water per gallon of fuel, or 4 to 7 gallons of water per gallon of fuel equivalent. That's a big deal. So I think we need to make sure as we move forward that we consider these other natural resources as we look at a transition to a different type of energy infrastructure, which brings to the point, as we are looking at less and less freshwater resources, what other resources do we have to supplement those freshwater supplies and support energy development and sustainable development? And a lot of people do not know that the EPA in 2020 started a national water reuse action plan focused on the use of non-traditional water resources as a way to supplement freshwater supplies and support economic development that way through treatment of non-traditional resources. And the 5 major areas that they picked were thermoelectric cooling water, treatment and reuse, agricultural wastewater, municipal wastewater, produced water from oil and gas, and stormwater. The point that I'd like to make here is I'm working on the produced water side, but 2 of the 5 are energy-related technology areas where their concept is these industrial waters from the energy sector could be and should be reused to support the energy sector and to reduce the freshwater use within the energy sector and supplement freshwater supplies out of these 2 energy sector elements. So I'm currently leading a program for produced water research in the state of New Mexico, and I'm working with the US EPA to coordinate those activities with other states like Arizona, Texas, Wyoming, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Pennsylvania. And I just wanted to mention that this whole issue around sustainable development goals out of the United Nations, 2 of those sustainable development goals identify water reuse as key to a more sustainable future. So the reuse of wastewater is what I think the worldwide people are looking at. Is we can't throw any water away. We now have to use that and use that appropriately to support economic development without having to rely totally on freshwater resources to do that. And so I just want to show an example of what we're seeing from, in this case, the Edison Electric Institute, which is the lobbying firm for the lobbying group for the investor-owned utilities, and they are pushing back on 100% carbon-free electric power generation and suggesting that only 80% of their demand can be met, or they can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 80% if they use natural gas and renewables. And the reason that I think that they're pushing that from a cost perspective is to try to keep the cost of energy down. But if you look at a lot of the places in the eastern U.S. where a lot of power plants are impacted by water availability, and as I mentioned, energy is the big user of water in the eastern U.S. You can see that all those power plants on these major streams, where these streams are beginning to reduce their water supplies and have less water supplies, and there's more competition with municipal supplies for that water, they're having water stress, a lot of water stress in the eastern U.S. But if you look where the oil shale is and where the produced water from oil shale development occurs, A lot of it occurs in those areas where there's significant natural gas resources, and means that there's significant places where natural gas could be used for power generation and reliable power generation. And then they've got the produced water to utilize instead of fresh water for their power plant cooling. But they also then have saltwater disposal wells and enhanced oil recovery wells that they can use to address that wastewater that comes from treating produced water and using it for electric power generation. And I think that that's why you'll see here in this Edison Electric press release that came out in January 2021. This was a press release that came out one day after President Biden had banned fracking, and that they wanted to get away from oil and natural gas. And Edison Electric essentially came out and said, we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. So they're addressing the carbon issue by switching from coal to natural gas and renewable energy. The more important thing that they said is, if you really want lead on the clean energy, you want to be able to still use natural gas. And but to eliminate the other 10 to 20%, they said that they're going to have long-term energy storage, which is very expensive. They're going to have carbon capture. They're going to have to get more transmission lines, which are very difficult to permit these days. So what they were making the case for was, let us get to 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We don't have to use additional water resources. We don't have to have higher energy costs. We don't have to do battery storage, which are not necessarily that functional at these large scales. And so they're looking more at a system level, system sustainability and natural resources sustainability perspective, which I think makes a lot of sense and that we need to do in the West. Finally, I think one or two more view graphs. One of the big issues with the use of non-traditional water resources has always been, gosh, the cost of treatment is so high. And I wanted to show on this slide, this is work that I've been doing with the desal community for the last 20 years in plotting up the cost of desalination of some of these non-traditional water resources. And if you look at thermoelectric power, the stuff that the EPA is talking about, thermoelectric power and treating that and reusing their blowdown is a brackish water. Agricultural return flows are essentially brackish waters. Produced water is a saline water. Some of the industrial wastewaters are saline waters, and even municipal wastewater has, in some places in the countries, in the West, for example, like Phoenix, trying to reuse wastewater now is you have to do desalination because the wastewater is so high in salinity, over 1,000 to 1,500 parts per million. In some of the Western communities. So everybody's going to have to use desal. But if you look at the cost of desal and you look at the marginal cost, which is the cost for the next increment of water, you're seeing that desalination is cost effective with going out and trying to bring in a new supply of fresh water. And yet it's very, very sustainable because you can use local supplies. And even when we're looking at produced water, the produced water costs for disposal are something on the order of $1 or $2, $3 a barrel, which equate to about $25 to $100 per 1,000 gallons. And even at that, we can get thermal technologies that can treat produced water to something below the disposal costs. So you can have an oil company can treat their water and essentially give it away and still make money because it's lower disposal costs. So we're at a point, I think, with the technology in a lot of this area for treatment that we can move forward without much difficulty. And the other thing that we want to mention in the West is that there's also a lot of brackish water to go along with those other non-traditional water resources that EPA is looking at. This is just the state of New Mexico. These are our brackish water aquifers, and the higher the color, the brighter the color, the higher TDS, but we have aquifers that are running 2,000 to 4,000 TDS, some that are running 5,000 or 6,000 TDS. But they're all easily treatable by today's standards from a cost perspective. In many of these areas, though, we haven't quantified the resource or the yield or the safe yield. Yeah, I don't know that in any of these areas we're going to find wells that'll give us 500 to 1,000 gallons per minute, like some of the freshwater wells that we use. But the fact is, in the state of New Mexico, we have something on the order of 2 to 4 billion cubic acre feet of brackish water that could be utilized. So if you're, from our standpoint, if you're using renewable energy and combined natural gas systems, and you're using brackish water or treated produced water to support those systems and to support that kind of electric power generation, or if we're looking at a hydrogen economy where we don't use fresh water, we treat the water from the oil and gas industry or from brackish water to create the water for the hydrogen, then we're being sustainable from a water supply standpoint and from a energy supply and sustainability standpoint. So I think we can transition to these new energy economies as long as we consider that we're probably going to have to look at the use of non-traditional or brackish water resources to support that as we move forward. And if we balance the combination of the low carbon and low water use technologies with smart use of fossil fuels and smart use of our water, we can probably develop systems that are highly sustainable, but also highly secure and highly reliable and resilient. So that's the end of my presentation. Hopefully it's a little bit broader than saying that sustainability is all around just greenhouse gases. Sustainability is much more than that. It's sustainability of other natural resources like water and land, but also economic sustainability. We don't have an infinite amount of money to put in for energy infrastructure. So the sustainability needs to be looked at from a broader perspective, as well as the whole concept when we're looking at energy transition, that the energy supply needs to be highly reliable and highly resilient as we move forward. So, Andy, that's my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions that you guys may have.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Really appreciate the path you wove and that you went down here, bringing the perspective back to the water piece of all this as well. George, would you like me to MC the Q&A session?
Please do, Andy, and I'll take the liberty to throw out a first question just to get things going, if that's okay. Mike, thanks very much for the presentation. It was really enjoyable. I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on the non-technical challenges you see, things like water rights and how that plays out both in New Mexico and perhaps more broadly in the Intermountain West. Water rights in particular, obviously, for non-traditional water sources.
Sure, and I think every state has a slightly different water rights in the prior appropriation states, like the western states. I know in Wyoming, all water in Wyoming is the water of the state. In New Mexico, the water rights are for fresh water, fresh groundwater, fresh surface water. In some states, water rights are only fresh surface water rights. Groundwater rights are a right of ownership. So they're always different. But I generally say in many cases from what we found is that these non-traditional water resources like produced water, the water rights are owned by the producer. It's kind of mining law. So the water rights don't belong to a family or the land. They belong to the person that develops them. Brackish water rights are a special water right in the state of New Mexico. So what you have to get if you want a brackish water right is you have to show that it doesn't impact freshwater resources. So there's oftentimes for these non-traditional waters, there's a different water right allocation And in many cases, these non-traditional waters are easier to get from a water rights perspective than non-traditional waters and like brackish water. Then some non-traditional waters like brackish water, produced water, are easier to get a water right because you don't have to buy that off of someone else. The other advantage of some of these non-traditional waters are that they're generally not considered in compact delivery. So the use of brackish water in Colorado is not considered in compact delivery requirements for going to the state of New Mexico. So we see that a lot in New Mexico versus Texas, is that if we can take brackish water and treat it, we do not have to provide any of that water through a compact into Texas, so that we can reuse that water again and again and again. Even if we use it to put in the Rio Grande or the Pecos River, that then doesn't become a water that has to go be shared with downstream. So there are some very unique water rights in each of the states that are in this I-West consortium. But in general, what we're finding is that the non-traditional water rights oftentimes are much more, much easier to handle and get and utilize for newer uses. Okay, that's okay. Hopefully that answered your question.
I think we can bend your ear for hours, Mike. So here's one from Babs Moran. Babs, do you want to ask your question, or would you like, if I don't hear you, I'll ask it, but if you chime in, you can ask it. Okay, I will ask Babs' question. Great presentation, Mike. Could you explain a comment that I thought I heard you make, that water availability has a role in climate change? I usually think of water availability as a result of climate change. Did I hear your comment correctly?
You may have heard it correctly. I don't know if I said it exactly right, but what I was trying to allude to is that we need to look at water supplies in the energy systems that we are looking at to try and reduce climate change. So if we try to go to zero greenhouse gas emissions, for example, for electric power, to do that, it may take significantly more water than if we tried to go to an 80% or a 75% reduction. So if we try to go to zero, there's some significant disadvantages potentially. And that's one of the things that I mentioned on the hydrogen. If we try to go to all transportation fuel being hydrogen, and we're talking about 2 to 3 times more water use to go to hydrogen to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, if we go to the point where we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to zero to reduce climate change, we could have a tremendous impact on the water demand for the energy that goes that direction. So that's what I was suggesting. Okay. And another example is if we try to say, let's just keep coal power plants and we just sequester all the coal with carbon sequestration, we essentially would double our water demand. And so by taking the step to go to keeping coal and going to 100% carbon sequestration, it's going to double the water demand for the power plants, which are already at about 50% of the water consumption in the United States right now, or water use. So, you got to be careful on what you ask for, because you got to look at, it's one thing to optimize for reducing carbon or CO2, but if that comes at the expense of doubling or tripling the demand for water, it may not be sustainable long term. I think that's what I was trying to get to, Andy.
So Mike, here's a follow on to this, because I was kind of thinking about this, and a lot of my colleagues here at LAN will know a lot more about this than I do. But one of the challenges with carbon sequestration, of course, is managing reservoir pressures. And some folks have looked at the releasing the pressure through brackish
carbon water
extraction.
extraction.
So
Yeah.
does that, have you or has anybody done a kind of a techno analysis on the, kind of it's almost like well, I was thinking like a water trade here, but the water that comes out with the benefit of the carbon sequestration, and then if we actually get to beneficial water, treating that water and using it.
Absolutely, and I think that's going to show up in the hydrogen economy for some of these hydrogen hubs for DOE. Let me just tell you how I think that might play out. And I think George and I have kind of discussed this maybe a little bit in some of the hydrogen meetings that we've had. For the western areas, putting in hydrogen hubs or in hydrogen development, you're if you try to use steam reforming and natural gas as an example, as the first step toward moving toward hydrogen, while you work on electrolyzers for green hydrogen, you're going to want to utilize natural gas. You're going to have water to do steam reforming, and you're going to want to capture the CO2. So if you're using produced water, for example, or brackish water, and you're injecting the CO2, you do replace by the CO2 you're injecting, you do get some water out. So there's actually some synergies associated with hydrogen development as you're doing blue hydrogen, sequestering the CO2 that you get out of the steam reforming of natural gas. You're getting more water that you can use for steam reforming. So that may be a very sustainable approach and process long term, because you're using non-traditional waters or wastewaters that you wouldn't use, and you're not having to use really any fresh water whatsoever. So that may have some advantages, significant advantages, because of the fact that you're displacing some of the produced water that you're now using then for the steam reforming as you're doing your CO2. So yes, it does work out pretty nicely. And I think that there's some interesting, now that's back of the envelope, first order look. And I think down the road, someone needs to look at that from a true technoeconomic analysis. But it looks like it's a very feasible concept based
So we,
upon what I've looked at so far.
that's great. So we have some questions in chat. I'll give you the option. I'll give you the option to ask your question. If you don't chime in, I'll ask it for you. Matthew. Okay, so Matthew Lisk asks, Mike, what are your thoughts on providing incentives for establishment of water right trading markets, particularly for trading water rights from consumptive uses to non-consumptive uses?
I think that at some point in time, people are going to go that route. Um, and I think there are some water markets that will come to bear, and I think those water markets actually might fit in nicely to encourage people to utilize some of these non-traditional water resources and treat them, and then put them into that water market and allow them for sale or movement. The biggest issue that I've got is uh, putting in water rights in southeastern New Mexico. I'm going to use that as an example, and then trying to get that up to Albuquerque, which is 300 miles away, uphill, is probably an issue. So I think that we're going to have to work through the whole water rights and the availability and point of diversion issues to start to work that correctly, or you're going to have people buying water rights up potentially that they're moving water out of certain areas that you don't want to have the water moved out of, and using it someplace else because of higher demand or something like that. I think you have to make it equitable such that you can move that water fairly around the states and different regions. But I do believe that water markets are going to be something that are going to end up showing up, and I think that they're probably needed in many cases.
That's great. We may come back to moving water molecules and electrons around, but let's move
Okay.
on to another question
Sorry.
that's sitting here. Jeff, did you want to ask your question? Okay, I will. So Jeff Haiku, really nice presentation, Mike. How far back in the energy supply chain do you recommend looking when considering water impacts? For example, do we need to consider water usage for mining critical to minerals? Andy, please read. I guess I did.
In my opinion, and comes from a guy that worked at Sandia for 38 years, which is a systems engineering lab. That's what we tell everybody. I believe you have to look at the whole system. I really believe that that's a big requirement. I think that we've looked at unit processes for way too long, and we don't look at the longer, bigger systems look. So I think mining is an example of looking at water to get critical minerals or whatever. It has an impact on overall energy development, energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, and things like that. So I think that it's the bigger system, and I and I'm not saying that we've got to go to the biggest system would be the whole globe, but I do believe that we need to be a little bit larger in a lot of our systems thinking than just one or two unit processes. I think we need to look at maybe out three or four levels of connection to look at that and make sure that we're not doing something that impacts uh, things negatively. The biggest example to me is biofuels, uh, irrigation of irrigated crops for biofuels is something that if you look at both the land and the resources and the water resources to do even 30 or 40% of our transportation fuels in the United States by biofuels has so many ramifications and disadvantages that it just doesn't make sense. And you don't have to go out. You have to go out more than two or three levels. But if you go out that far, you find out that immediately that, oh my gosh, this is not something that could work really well. You have to go to something other than that approach. But that's my suggestion. Systems level thinking is good. Don't just make the system a real small system. Look out a couple of levels and see what you get. I don't know that you have to go all the way to the whole world, but or the whole globe, but at least two or three levels of systems thinking, of interactions and integration.
So I'm going to stick one in here before Prashant because it fits with your last answer, which gets back to your issue of moving water around because if we produce water in the gas field, putting it somewhere where it can be of use, maybe we're doing hydrogen, but maybe we're not. So a question back to your biofuels is, if we're producing water and we can treat it to the right level, does it become more attractive than you just inferred if we could actually we could be irrigating biofuels with that water closer to that location?
Yep, and that's the synergies of looking at the systems level. So yeah, looking at the systems level, that's absolutely correct. And I'll give you an example on the biofuels. So it's not only just growing corn, but you could do algae as an example. Algae biofuels, they don't have to require fresh water. They can use brackish water. So you treat say produced water that's brackish or saline to a intermediate level, maybe 10 or 15,000 TDS, pretty inexpensive. You then use that water for biofuels, for algal biofuels, and you could create a sustainable market of water and fuel that way. But you've looked at the whole system, and I think that that's the point: is looking at the whole system. You could make the systems work and actually do that appropriately.
Right. So sorry about that, Prashant. I jumped in on top of you.
That was a very good point, and that's a good question. And there are places where if you do that correctly, you can make the energy system and the water system compatible and both sustainable through this ecological what did we used to call it, Andy, in the old days?
We,
Uh, I
we
don't
had
know.
we had a lot of descriptive
Terms. Okay. Anyway, it was ecological or manufacturing ecology or something like that, where all of the guys work together and they all the systems are connected. So okay.
a lot of synergies there. Okay, Prashant, did you want to jump in, or if I don't hear from you, I'll read your question. Okay. Prashant Sharan says, Mike, you mentioned that the produced water disposal cost can be between $25 to $100 per 1,000 gallons. Then, why is oil and gas industry reluctant to go toward desal treatment route, given the given the fact that we can treat these highly saline waters with brine concentrator and crystallizer for less than $25 per 1,000 gallons, and simultaneously produce clean drinking water?
Very good question. So, what are the oil and gas guys focused on? They're focused on oil, which is actually a byproduct of oil and gas production because they create 5 barrels of water for every barrel of oil. So water is water's the primary product, and oil is the byproduct. But the byproduct has more value than the major product, and so they see the industry sees water as a waste and not as a benefit. And so currently, I would say over the last 50 years, that's exactly the way they handled produced water. I will tell you right now that every producer of produced water in the Permian Basin is involved with our consortium looking at, they know that it's unsustainable. They have run out of pore space to dump that water in. They know that there's more and more water being developed. And so they're all in our consortium trying to identify ways to cost effectively treat the water and get the regulations in place to allow them to do that. Currently, there are no regulations in place that allow anyone in the state of New Mexico to use produced water. So we're having to bring along the New Mexico Environment Department to do that. And industry is working hand in hand with us, along with the Environment Department, to try to make those regulations. My expectation is when those regulations become in place in the next 2 to 3 years, you will see a significant change in direction of the oil and gas guys in using and treating produced water because it is going to end up in the long term being less costly for them. Luckily, it's going to be more sustainable for the state of New Mexico at the same time. Hopefully that answered that question. It's the legal capability is not there to do it, so they're not doing it, but we're trying to change that legal landscape so that the permitting and legal landscape are in place to do that safely and ecologically friendly.
So we're coming up on the 3 o'clock hour here. I'm going to read Babs' comment. I think it's more just a comment, but you may want to comment on it. And she says about the biofuels and the water, about biofuels, the water usage is why the biofuels industry is moving towards using the crop wastes, forest waste, and other waste carbon resources. So I think that gets back to your find the synergies, find the economic pathway, right?
Right, and I think that they've all recognized how big of that. That's exactly why they're going that route, because they say, "Uh-oh, this is not sustainable." Yep. So they're going a different pathway, right?
And
I agree with Babs. I'm glad she agrees with me.
Thanks, Mike.
John Prine sang a song about this. So JS, she points out or asks, which system is more efficient for reduced water treatment, centralized or distributed?
Good question. All of the above. And the reason, let me tell you why. Every basin is slightly different. The Permian Basin is a mature basin, huge basin, a lot of produced water. It's been around for 70 years, 80 years. There's a lot of already infrastructure already in place. And with that old of a field, you can utilize a lot of existing infrastructure. You take the San Juan Basin in northwestern New Mexico as an example, at the Four Corners with Colorado. That is a basin that a different geology. It's not a flat geology. It's a lot of rolling hills. So nothing's really, they're all kind of individual wells. 2 or 3 wells are teamed together. That's at the most. And so there you would need a much smaller treatment system, a more mobile treatment system, just because there's not the quantities that can be collected into one area. So my expectation is in the Permian Basin, as an example, you'll see a lot of larger, slightly distributed treatment systems, maybe on the order of 2 to 3 million gallons a day, which is kind of the size of a typical municipality's treatment plant, maybe 20 or 30 of those. Long term, that's my expectation. With a few mobile systems or smaller systems. In the San Juan, you'll probably not see a single one of a system that size. You'll see things that are in the 30 to 50,000, 100,000 gallons per day systems, smaller systems, just because of the geography, geology of the of that basin and the amount of water that they produce. So it's going to depend on basin. I think you're going to see a combination of all of those. And in the big basins where you can get the infrastructure, you'll get the cost down much easier. But they also have a much, because it's easy to get them and easy to dispose of the water. Their disposal costs there are oftentimes less. And in some of the smaller basins that are harder to get to, oftentimes the disposal costs are much higher there. And so you can still make a small distributed system be cost effective, just because their the cost target is much higher because of their remoteness and smaller, more difficult in getting water to disposal wells and things like that.
So
okay, hopefully that answered that question.
Are you willing to stick around for one more, since
I can stick around for you, Andy. I'll stick around for 3 more questions.
Okay, I might have one there. Okay, I'll add one there.
Somebody, feel free, whoever that was, feel free to.
This is Steve Long with HQ. And Mike, you're familiar, I'm pretty sure, with the technoeconomic models of produced water from Sandia, right? Did you work on that? Or you sound like you're familiar with that anyway, even if you didn't work on it.
I worked with Vince Tidwell on that.
Okay.
When I say I worked with Vince Tidwell did the work, his Sandia team and team from UNM, University of New Mexico, and maybe a couple of others. But I did work on that model.
So the question is, okay, so you know how it is when we do research, you never answer the complete question. There's always another question to ask. So if we were to continue that, what would we work on? Yeah, to be able to use it more as a policy or even research perspectives, to be able to see, okay, what should we work on, or where could we focus on? Yeah.
Sure. The problem, that's kind of, I would say it's a problem. All of those models need to be based upon the economics of the state that you're in, and so and generally the counties that you're working in. So that model was predominantly set up for working in the Permian Basin with the economics of the counties in the Permian Basin. And so if you're looking at options to use, other options to use produced water for economic development, then you're going to have a different amount of agriculture in southeastern New Mexico than you might have in northwestern New Mexico. You'd have a different opportunity for different industries. So you kind of have to have some site specific things in there. So if I wanted to transition that model to the San Juan Basin in New Mexico or the DJ Basin in Colorado, I would have to put in the local economic issues, capabilities of what the tax rates are, and trickle down into how many jobs would be created with different uses of the water. And you might have in the DJ Basin, you might have more opportunities for agriculture, different types of agriculture than you would have in southern New Mexico. So the model is good. I think it's a good general model, but I think to use it in a different basin, you're going to have to modify some of the input parameters that you've got there. So hopefully that answers your question. That's if I was going to use that for a state, a whole state, I would have to go to, and that state had 3 basins. I would have to modify it for those 3 basins to make sure that it matched for those specific basins. Okay.
Excellent. Thanks.
Okay.
So we got one more here that I want to throw in. Will any of the solar thermal desal technologies coming out of the American Made Challenges Solar Thermal Desal Competition, which is not a program I'm familiar with, help enable produced water desal, especially in terms of cost? Do you have hopes for the new tech being developed in that competition?
So it's a question about
It's
new.
specifically, yeah, it's specifically about the American-made challenge.
I'm familiar with that, but they say solar desal or solar desal for produced water or solar desal for seawater, or did they say?
Will it help enable produced water desal, especially in terms of cost?
Okay. All right. Actually, we wrote letters of support from our consortium for 2 or 3 of those companies, and 2 of them won their awards, and they're actually going to be doing testing in cooperation with us in the Permian Basin. So we actually even had a meeting today, right before this meeting, with one of those companies. I will tell you that we just finished up a test for produced water treatment with a company out of Canada called Crystal Clear Water Resources that was able to use waste heat from compressor stations. So they had some very favorable results with that. Some low costs associated with that because their energy costs were all reclaimed heat from a compressor station. So the point is that we've already got some data that says some of these technologies can use heat from any source, including solar, if it's of the right heat content for the types of so either solar or recovered heat from the oil and gas industry. So we're seeing that yes, there's a huge opportunity, and if you look at that, the thermal desalination technologies. I think about one third the cost is just the heat required and the energy required. So if you could use solar or you can use the waste heat, you can reduce your cost by 30 to 40%. And we've been able to demonstrate that in the last couple of months with some technologies we've evaluated. And we'll get more information on that solar desal price in the next year or so as these technologies come to bear and we measure those here in the oil field through our consortium. So,
wow, that's a pretty encouraging note right there.
I think it's very encouraging. I think it's now you have to look at the capital costs of the solar, but I think from an operational perspective, there's a high enough quality heat that we're able to get some very, very good results so far.
All right. Well, I'm watching the numbers start to tick down here.
Yeah,
So,
they've had
yeah,
enough of me talking.
I want to,
It's
I want to
that's
thank you. You know, Mike, you've always been such an inspiration for me. I've learned so much from you over the years, and it was just a real pleasure having you here with us with this whole group today. I don't know if people want to join me in a virtual
plan.
thank you, but that was a super that was just a super great discussion that you just led. I think you touched on some really important areas around the board, and I'm sure that there will be some desire to have some continued discussion with you as well.
My pleasure. Looking forward to working with you again, Andy, whenever you get a chance. Maybe this hydrogen hub thing will allow us to do some more work together.
I actually, I will reach out. I would like to find a way to do that, Mike.
Yeah, because I think the state of New Mexico is going to need non-traditional water resources to support the hydrogen hub. And produced water is a great non-traditional water resource. There's a lot of other infrastructure right there where all the produced water is coming from that can make it probably pretty inexpensive if we do it right. Okay.
Oh, iWest is just such a great place to have this discussion, you know, because we're talking with people who really understand what their needs and challenges in the region are, whether it's in their communities, with their companies, with their co-ops. And then, you know, you got some technology at the national laboratories and the universities. It's a great place to bring together the needs, the challenges, the opportunities, and really try to work towards the best solution for the place, you know, because
Yeah,
this is place-based science that we're talking about.
exactly. Okay.
All right.
You guys,
Thank you all. Thank you all for attending today. And let me reiterate again the website where you can find this information. I think George just posted it. Is at iWest. Gosh, let me make sure I get this right so I don't say it wrong. I think it's iWest dot. iWest.org, yeah. So iWest.org, you'll be able to find the video of Mike's talk and continue the conversation as needed.
Thank you, Andy. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day.
You too.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.